Wars today aren't fought by raising taxes first. They're fought with the money printing press. Stay with me here for just a second and let's dive deeper into this. If the US government had to send you a bill for every single month that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were waging, if you saw a line item on your paycheck that said war tax $500, would those wars have really lasted for 20 years? Here's what most people don't realize. Although many have heard lately that the national debt just crossed $37 trillion, most either don't realize or have forgotten that the war on terror alone, the wars we've been fighting since 9/11 2001, has cost us over $8 trillion according to Brown's University's Cost of War project. That's 22% or almost 1/4 of our entire national debt that everyone is talking about. But here's the sneaky kicker. We never felt it. Not directly at least. There was no war tax, no rationing, no war bonds drive like your grandparents had to do during World War II. How did we pay for 22 years of wars without anyone really noticing? The answer changed everything about how government can wage war, and it's costing all of us more than we realize. Let me show you how we got here, and why endless wars might have not been possible without one simple trick that happened in 1971. Before we had fiat money, before governments could create money out of thin air, wars were expensive, and everyone knew it. Under the gold standard, every dollar had to be backed by actual gold sitting in a vault. Governments couldn't just print money to fund a war. They had three options: raise taxes, borrow money, or sell off assets. And all three options meant citizens felt the pain immediately. Let me give you some real numbers to put this in perspective. World War I cost the United States about $383 billion in today's dollars. How did we pay for it? With Liberty bonds and massive tax hikes. Regular Americans were buying war bonds at rallies. Everyone was chipping in because they had to. World War II was even bigger, $4.1 trillion in today's money. The government didn't hide the cost. They jacked up the marginal tax rate to, guess what, 94%. I would bet even Bernie Sanders would not dare to go back to those rates these days. Plus, every American and families was buying war bonds. You couldn't buy sugar, gas, or rubber whenever you wanted. Everyone sacrificed. Everyone knew we were at war because they felt in their wallets every single day. Even in Vietnam, which only cost about $1 trillion in today's dollars. I say only compared to what came next in the Middle East. Vietnam showed us how this really works. The government needed money for the war, but President Johnson didn't want to raise taxes right away. He wanted both his Great Society programs and the war. So what happened? The government started borrowing. But here's the twist. We were still technically on the gold standard. But the Federal Reserve had started buying government bonds with newly created dollars. This was different from World War II, where regular citizens bought bonds with their existing savings. When the Fed creates new money to buy government debt, you're not just moving money around. You're adding more dollars to the system. And when those new dollars are buying bombs instead of building factories to create consumer goods, you get more money chasing the same amount of goods. That equals inflation. Prices went from rising 1% a year in 1965 to nearly 6% in 1970. Americans watched their purchase powers evaporate. Grocery cost more, gas cost more, everything cost more. And unlike other wars after Vietnam, the government haven't learned how to hide the cost yet. They eventually had to add a 10% tax surcharge in 1968. People saw it right on their paychecks. A war tax. Combined with inflation eating away at their savings and their kids getting drafted, Americans had had enough. The economic pain of that war helped fuel massive protest. When citizens directly feel the cost of the war, they demand answers. They demand that it ends. Here's the key points. In the hard money era, starting a war meant asking your citizens to immediately sacrifice. Every bomb drop meant less money in someone else's pocket. Every tank built meant higher taxes. Politicians had to look voters in the eye and say, this war is worth your sacrifice. And if voters disagreed, that war ended. But everything changed in 1971. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon goes on television and drops what historians now call the Nixon shock. In that speech, Nixon ended the convertibility of dollars to gold. And just like that, the US dollars became pure fiat currency, backed by nothing except for the government's promise. Most people didn't understand what just happened, but that single decision fundamentally changed how governments could fund wars. See, under the old Bretton Woods system, if the government wanted to spend more money than it collected in taxes, it had to borrow real money from real people who expected it to be paid back with interest. There were limits, there were consequences. But after 1971, the Federal Reserve could create money with a few keystrokes. When the government needed to fund a war, it could issue treasury bonds and the Fed could just easily buy them with newly created money. No tax hikes needed, no war bonds drive, no immediate sacrifice from citizens. And that's exactly what happened with the war on terror. The Afghanistan war, the Iraq war, operations in Syria, Pakistan, and dozens of other countries. Brown University's research shows it all added up to more than $8 trillion. That's 12 zeros behind the number 8. That's double what World War II cost us adjusted for inflations. Yikes. But here's the crazy part. We fought these wars for 20 years, and most Americans never felt a direct economic impact. No rationing, no war bonds, no special war tax on your paycheck. In fact, we got a tax cuts during a wartime, something that would have been unthinkable before the fiat currency system. Think about this comparison. World War II cost 4.1 trillion and lasted 4 years with entire countries mobilized. The war on terror cost 8 trillion and lasted 20 years, and most people could ignore it if they wanted to. How is that possible? It's simple, but sneaky. We printed the money, or more accurately, we borrowed it into existence. The Federal Reserve enabled the government to fund these wars without asking its citizens for immediate sacrifice. The bill gets pushed into the future, hidden in the national debt. Without fiat money, there's no way that politicians could have maintained public support in any way for 20 years of war. But when you don't have to send taxpayers a bill, when you don't have to ration goods, when you can fund a war without most people noticing, well, that's when wars become endless. In case some of you caught this one thing that didn't add up, during Vietnam, we saw inflation hit 6%, but during the Iraq and Afghanistan, inflation stayed around 2 or 3%. Did we somehow get a free war? No, the government just got way smarter about hiding the cost. See, during Vietnam, when they printed money, it went straight into the economy. More dollars chasing the same amount of goods equals obvious inflations. Everyone noticed their grocery cost more, and the government got massive backlash. But by the time of Iraq and Afghanistan, they learned their lesson. They developed new tricks to hide inflation. First, they changed how they measured it. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI, got adjusted over the years. When beef gets too expensive, they assume you buy chicken instead, so inflation looks lower. When houses get expensive, they use something called owner's equivalent rent instead of actual home prices. Healthcare costs exploded 300%. College tuition went up by 500%. Housing doubled and then tripled. But hey, TVs and computers got cheaper, so official inflation was only 2%. Second, they used globalization as a pressure valve. All those newly printed dollars, we sent them to China in exchange for cheap goods. We literally exported our inflation. China got our dollars, and we got cheap stuff at Walmart. And the inflation problem seemed solved, well, at least temporarily. Third, and this is the really clever part, the new money went into assets first instead of our consumer goods. The stock market tripled. Real estate went crazy. If you owned assets, you got rich from money printing. If you were trying to buy a house or save for retirement, you got crushed. But it didn't show up as inflation. The Fed also learned to park trillions in bank reserves after 2008. They actually paid banks interest to not lend money. It's like printing money, but keeping it locked in a digital vault. Until it isn't. But here's the thing. You can't hide this forever. All that money printing from 20 years of war, it's hitting now. We're seeing the worst inflation in 40 years. Gas, groceries, rent, everything's exploding in price. The bill always comes due. We just really got good at delaying it. And that's just inflation. Let's talk about the debt itself. Let's start with what's happening here at home. We're paying $952 billion just in interest on the national debt this year alone. That's almost $1 trillion that could have gone to infrastructure, education, healthcare, anything productive. Instead, it's paying interest on money we borrowed to fund wars. Speaking of the debt, $37 trillion. That's over $100,000 for every single American. Your share of national debt from these wars? About $25,000. Your kids' share? Same amount. Their kids? They're born owing it too. But the costs go way beyond money. Overseas, the human cost is staggering. Brown University's research showed these wars directly killed over 900,000 people, nearly 1 million human beings. And that's just direct deaths, people that are killed by bombs and bullets. The indirect deaths from disease, displacement, and destroyed infrastructure, it's estimated at 3.6 to 3.8 million more. 38 million people have been displaced from their homes, entire regions destabilized for generations, power vacuums that lead to groups like ISIS. And here's something that most people don't think about. This has consequences for the dollar itself. When we weaponize the dollar to fund endless wars, other countries notice. China, Russia, and even some of our allies are actively working to create alternatives to the dollar based system. They're tired of us being able to print money for wars while they have to hold dollars that we're constantly devaluing. If the world moves away from the dollars as the reserve currency, and that's a real possibility, we lose our ability to fund wars cheaply. But more importantly, we lose our massive economic advantage that's been propping up our standard of living for decades. The fiat money system hasn't eliminated the cost of war, it's just hidden them, spread them out, and pushed them into the future. But the bill always comes due. Here's what really gets me about all this. We've created a system where the most important decision a democracy can make, whether to go to war, has been completely disconnected from democratic accountability. Think about it. In a democracy, if the government wants to build a new highway, there's a debate about whether it's worth tax money. If they want to fund a new program, we argue about the budget. But war? 20 years of war? $8 trillion? Somehow that happens without most citizens even noticing the economic impact. I keep coming back to this thought. If every missile launch meant an immediate tax bill in your mailbox, if every month of war meant higher taxes that you could see and feel, would we have stayed in Afghanistan for 20 years? Would we have invaded Iraq in the first place? The fiat money system has broken the feedback loop between war and its cost. And without the feedback loop, wars can drag on indefinitely. Politicians can start wars without asking for sacrifice. They can continue wars without facing economic pressures from voters. The costs get hidden in inflation and debt that won't fully hit until they're out of the office. For me, as someone who studies finance and helps people plan for their future, this is deeply troubling. We're essentially running up a credit card bill that our children will have to pay. We're destroying the value of savings through inflation to fund wars that most Americans have forgotten are even happening. So, what do we do about it? Here are 3 things I think we need to seriously consider. First, demand transparency. If the government wants to go to war, they should have to show us the real cost, not hide them in deficit spending. I'd love to see a requirement that any military action lasting more than 90 days requires a dedicated war tax. Make the cost visible. Make them immediate. Let democracy actually work. Second, we need fiscal constraints. No more blank checks for endless wars. If we're going to spend $8 trillion, maybe we should have actually raised that money instead of printing it. Congress should be required to pay for wars as we fight them, not push the bill to future generations. Third, we need to seriously explore alternatives to pure fiat currency. Now, I'm not saying that we need to go back to the gold standard. That ship has sailed. But whether it's fiscal rules that limit money printing or new technologies like Bitcoin that can be inflated away, we need some kind of constraints on the government's ability to fund wars through the printing press. Look, I'm not naive. I know governments aren't going to voluntarily give up the power to print money. But as citizens, as voters, as people who care about our economic future, we need to understand this connection between fiat money and endless wars. We need to demand better. Because here's the bottom line. Every empire in history that debased its currency to fund military adventures eventually collapsed. Rome did it. Spain did it. Britain did it. The pattern is always the same. Print money to fund wars, devalue the currency, lose economic competitiveness, and eventually lose the empire. We're $37 trillion in debt. We're spending almost $1 trillion a year just on interest. We've been at war for essentially my entire adult life. And at some point, something has to give. So here's my question for you. And I really want you to think about this. If every bomb dropped meant an instant tax increase on your paycheck, if you could see the cost of war in real time in your bank account, would these endless wars still happen? The fiat money system broke the feedback loop. Politicians can start war with borrowed money, fight them with printed money, and push the cost onto people who haven't even been born yet. $8 trillion that could have rebuilt America's infrastructure or been left in your pocket. Gone. And most Americans forgot these wars were even happening. The links between the fiat money and endless war isn't some conspiracy theory. It's basic economics. When you remove immediate cost of war, you remove the incentives to end wars. And that's exactly what happened after 1971. So, what do you think? Am I crazy for suggesting that fiat money is the hidden fuel behind endless wars? Or have we created a system that makes war too easy to start and too easy to continue? Let me know in the comment below. I read all of them, and I'm genuinely curious what you think about this. If this video made you think differently about money, war, and how our system really works, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this. These are some of the conversations that we need to be having. Please subscribe if you want more content that connects finance, psychology, and the real forces shaping our world. My name is Luke, and I'll see you in the next one.